Wow. Thank you. I'm here today to talk about a crisis in information security. I believe we have a crisis, and I believe it's a crisis of credibility, where we have no credibility because we have no data. And because we have no credibility and no data, we have a major set of problems that underpin everything that we do. And I'd like to talk to you about this crisis, where it comes from, and what we can do to get out of it. I do want to say that these opinions are mine. They don't represent Microsoft, any US investment bank, Wikipedia, or any other source. They do reflect a lot of what Andrew Stewart and I wrote about in the New School of Information Security. So I believe that we have a problem, that we have this crisis. When NASA tells the astronauts to wrap this box in socks, people believed them. The astronauts did it, they survived, they got back to Earth. But when we go to people and we say, you need to do this thing to protect yourself, they don't believe us. They say, nah, you've been telling me this for years. Management doesn't believe us. If you work in network operations, some of the people you work with don't believe you. And we have a major credibility gap. Now, some people disagree with me. They say that we're making progress. And this is a graph of the progress that we're making. It is incidents reported to US CERT in fiscal years 2005 through 2007, as reported by GAO. And it went from about 3,000 to about 14,000. So really, I don't know how much progress like this we're able to take. I think any more progress like this, and we might all go mad. Now, one thing you might say is this is the wrong thing to measure. That you shouldn't be looking at incidents reported to US CERT. You should be looking to some other measure to decide whether or not we're making progress. And I agree with that. I actually think that what you measure is what you improve. And a lot of my thinking in this is actually influenced by this great book, Moneyball. Have people here read Moneyball? Very few. Andrew's going to hurt me for this, but go out and buy this book before you buy ours. It's that good. What Moneyball is about is how baseball statistics are measuring the wrong thing, and how by measuring different things, teams actually manage to do incredibly well relative to their budget. So highly worthwhile. Michael Lewis, you might know his writing because he writes a lot about the financial crisis. So I would recommend this book. And I think it's also important to say we work very, very hard in information security. We often work much harder for the results that we get than we need to work. We drive, we push, we try and get ourselves up the hill. And I apologize if you can't quite see the image. It's a guy pushing a ball inside a little hamster wheel, trying to make it up an inclined plane. And he's not getting very far. But people solve really, really complex problems. I believe that the sort of problems that people have solved out there in the world are larger and more complex than many of the problems we face in information security. This device, this is a picture of an astrolabe. It's designed to predict the movement of the planets. And these were constructed during the Renaissance. They were constructed before computers, by people who, very much like watchmakers, they built these complex devices with which they could make these predictions. And figuring out where the planets are going to be is an incredibly useful thing if, say, you're trying to navigate or predict when an eclipse will happen. And people solved these problems before their computers. Kepler figured out laws of motion. And he did this based on observations of where the planets were that people took through telescopes that are worse than what you can get for $50 at a toy store today. The telescopes that were available were awful. The data transmission was incredibly poor. And he figured out that every planet moves in an eclipse around the sun, but that the speed of the planet is based on the line moving through an equal area of the eclipse over time. And the squares of the orbital periods of planets are directly proportional to the cubes of the semi-major axis of the orbit. Everyone understand that? Everyone confident that you could do that without a computer? You could. And it's not just mathematical problems which we can solve without computers by applying ourselves. Smallpox is one of the, if not the deadliest disease in history. In the first 79 years of the past century, 500 million people died because of smallpox. 15 million people a year were dying in the 1960s. Half of all of the blindness in Asia was a direct result of people surviving smallpox and losing their vision. And what's, to me, is most interesting is that I chose the year 1979 because that was the last recorded instance of smallpox. And this is the unfortunate gentleman who was the last person in the world to suffer from smallpox in the wild. There was one other case in a lab in Britain after this. And we conquered this disease. We put an end to it through effort. And this is not a technical problem. This is a sociological problem. It's a medical problem. It requires changing the way people behave. It requires changing the way people think about the environment around them. And this is really similar. I'm talking about this because we have both technical and non-technical problems in information security. And it's important to understand that the tools which we have used to solve problems out there in the world can be applied to information security, whether it's convincing people to not leave their machine unlocked, whether it's figuring out better defenses against buffer overflows. There are ways we can do this, and at the core of this is the scientific method. The scientific method, you've got Isaac Newton observing the apple falling and thinking, what does that mean? What does it mean for an apple to fall? What does it mean for Katie to be eating an apple in my talk? But we observe. As people, we observe. And sometimes as we observe, we need instruments to make those observations. And we've got up here strobe photography, which proved horses actually leave the ground. This was a bet. Fascinating little story. Horses leave the ground when they're galloping. None of their feet are on the ground at given points. And two guys made a bet over that. And in order to settle the bet, one of them went out and invented strobe photography. Because how else are you going to figure out where the horse's feet are if you can't take precise measurements? So some of these are a little more complicated. I have a side interest in the history of science. You sometimes have to arrange your observations. And this is the oil drop experiment, which some of you may remember. The mass of the electron, or the charge of the electron, excuse me, was figured out by creating this vacuum chamber through which you drop oil mist and you adjust the electrical charge on these plates. And at some point, you get a drop of oil floating in between these two plates. So this is not a simple machine. This is not a simple device that we used, but people were interested in what's happening and built devices that allowed them to analyze the questions which were of concern to them and figure out the electrical charge on an electron, which helped us build things like computers and PowerPoint and projectors that allow me to put this up on screen without one of those little slide projectors that we used to have. So in a nutshell, the scientific method is at the heart of all of this. And in a nutshell, what the scientific method is form an interesting hypothesis and find a method to test it. And when you test it, you are looking to prove that you are wrong, that you have a hypothesis that is wrong, and you can demonstrate that it's wrong through some form of experiment. And the really interesting hypotheses are surprising, they're broad, they're predictive, and they're testable. When Darwin wrote about evolution by means of natural selection and the survival of the fittest, that was a really surprising hypothesis to some people back then, and perhaps even today some people have problems with it. It's also really broad. We can look at evolution not only in natural life, we can look at evolution in artificial life. There's a whole field of genetic fitness of software. You can look at evolution. People have applied it to societies. It's a really broad hypothesis, and it allows you to make predictions which you can then test. You can say, for example, if we have a wave of pollution that turns all of the birch trees black, all of the moths will also turn black. And in fact, in England during the Industrial Revolution, exactly that happened. The moths turned color because the light ones, which used to be very evolutionary fit, would fly up against the polluted tree, be very visible to a bird, and be eaten. And so you try and find a method of testing your observation, of proving it wrong, through either observation or experiment. And I'd like to compare and contrast that a little bit with what I call the security method, which is you form an interesting hypothesis, you advocate for it really loudly, you claim it's a really, really big problem. Say, wireless networks, insecure. This has worked really well. I can no longer log into my neighbor's wireless networks, which when you're traveling around is a real pain in the butt. It's not clear if anyone is actually any more secure, but people advocated for this problem. And another part of the security method is giving things cutesy names. Examples like spearfishing and whaling. Does anyone outside the security industry actually understand what you mean if you say whaling? They understand fishing through perhaps massive repetition. But whaling was really, to my mind, it's putting out a cutesy name for a problem. And what never really happened is any form of testing. No one ever said, how big a problem is this? How widespread is this? How impactful is this? Why is this meaningful? But it had a really good, cute name. And if we are going to make progress in security, I believe we need to start testing our ideas. We need to start testing our assertions. We need to start testing what we're doing and admitting, beyond admitting, hoping we can do better. Because by and large, when we go out there and say, I'd like $500,000 for this or $1 million for that, our management says, why should we give you this money? And we say, well, because we think it will make things better. And that's not good enough. It is not working, it's not functional, and we can do better. So I'd like to look a little bit at some possible data sources. I'd like to look at surveys in the trade press, vulnerability data, because some people have actually said to me that we actually have a lot of data. And they've put some of these things up there as ideas. And so before I actually talk about these, I'd like to actually ask the question, what is good data? What do we actually want our data to be? We'd like our data to be reflective of reality. We'd like it to be broad. We'd like it to be accurate. We'd also like it to be testable. And so when we look at something like surveys, surveys are great instruments for finding out how people feel. Do you feel the president is doing a good job? Have you read this book, right? I got sort of accurate data. It was interesting. 2 people raised their hands, and then another couple sort of raised their hands later on. So maybe that's a memory effect. Maybe that's, oh yeah, I did read that book. But surveys aren't if you ask a question like, is security awareness training a good investment? A survey will tell you what people believe, but what people believe is shaped by previous surveys. It's shaped by our expectations. It's shaped by the fact that I went and argued for a budget to do security training, and now I darned well better say it's effective. So I think there's a lot that surveys can tell us, but they really don't get to the question that I'm really interested in, which is what is effective security practice and what is cost-effective security practice. The trade press does some good stuff. They help communicate about what's going on. And this is not a critique, this is an observation. The trade press is interested in selling copies of what it is they're writing. The more controversial it appears, the more likely you are to click on it. It's human nature. They understand that because they are working to work through difficult economic times. And so rather than really, or excuse me, because there are some good security journalists, some of them are in this room, and I'm not critiquing them. But as a group, I believe they are motivated to really go and look for the controversy, look for the exciting story, and sometimes being effective is boring because nothing went wrong and there's no good story to report on. Sunny Day in Paradise doesn't sell newspapers. It might sell travel, but not newspapers. So vulnerability data. Vulnerability data is another really interesting source of data that we could look to. And I love vulnerabilities. I love exploit information because implicit in the idea that here is proof of concept code is a scientific test. The hypothesis is this system doesn't have any buffer overflows in it. The experiment is the proof of concept. You run the proof of concept, you see what happens. And that is, in a nutshell, the scientific method. Now, we might decide we want a better hypothesis. We might want a hypothesis like this system will resist attack by a skilled attacker for 6 hours, 6 days, 6 months. We might want a hypothesis that this system can be configured and deployed by a system administrator or a CISSP and operate for a year without causing substantial vulnerability. That's a broader hypothesis than this system doesn't have any buffer overflows. It's also an important broad hypothesis with an impact which is relatively easy to tie back to the business question at hand, which is this a good investment? Honey-nets are another really important source of data, and I love what the Honey-net project is doing. If you're not familiar with it, a honey-net is you put a system on an isolated network, you watch what happens. Because there's no legitimate use of that network, everything on it is a problem, and so you get to observe problems. Now, this is great. We get to actually observe problems. We can learn things from that. But then there's a difference as we move to a situation in which we actually have human beings using the computers. They might do things like write down their passwords. I've never seen a honey-net with the password written on a yellow sticky. But that might be an interesting problem in operations in real systems. So honey-nets are great, but they're not as broad as we'd like. People also tell me that their personal experience can be a good guide. And I don't disagree, but I do question how broadly we can learn from each other's personal experience. I question how effectively we share information, and I question how well we actually distinguish the organizational environment in which doing this worked, and then bring it into a different environment, and it doesn't work as well. So experience is useful, but it's not as useful as actually being able to test things. So I believe that we want more and better data so that we can actually go ahead and test hypotheses and disprove them. That the core of getting away from a crisis is this ability to test and disprove ideas. That until I can say, until I go from being able to say, that's the worst idea I've ever heard, to being able to say, that's the worst idea I've ever heard because when I put your system in front of 100 people, not one of them could actually operate it successfully. Those are very different statements. The first is opinion. It's personal. The second is, I ran this test of something we care about, and what you are trying to propose will not function in an environment that has people like those 100 people. And we cannot do that for almost any system or interesting question in security today, and it is killing us. We need to address questions of what causes security pain. We need to understand, is it the Russian business network? Is it the script kiddie who takes Metasploit? Is it the Uber hacker? Is it espionage? What fraction of incidents for your organization are caused by each of these? Does anyone have an answer? No. We don't know these things, and without knowing these things, when we go and talk to management, they say, well, I just read this article. How many people have gotten this article out of an Airplane magazine from an executive with a note on it saying, what are we doing about this? And some of you are grimacing. I won't say anything more. So the final, I think another key question, the final key question that I want to ask is, for any given proposed method of spending money, how effective is it going to be? And I'm including insurance in that. Maybe there are security problems which we should just insure away because the cost of addressing them is so high and the impact is relatively small that we should just buy insurance to take that money, to take that cost. Until we actually can test and analyze and share that experience, we will not make progress. And we won't make progress in part because when we go to the people who control the purse strings, they're going to ask questions like these, and we're going to we are going to continue to say, oh, I don't know. And they're going to continue to say, come back when you do. I'd like to talk about another book that really inspired me a lot.
Just some of the feedback that has been so far. Some of the questions that have come up have been, what key performance indicators, what metrics would you say? What key performance indicators or metrics would you say that people should be collecting? Also, one of the things was, why not more blame for the folks who produce crap? One of the questions that came up.
Okay, so I'm actually going to go into answering the first question through the second half of this talk. What should we be doing? And the reason I don't think that we should be blaming people for producing crap is I've been working in software since 1991, and there's been a lot of crap in that time. Back in 1991, I had crap from a bunch of Unix vendors who sold me things like NIS, who took years to produce updates. And I think that historically it's been very, very hard to assess what the good investments to produce more secure software are. Now, I will say that I'm a little bit biased. About a little under 3 years ago, I joined Microsoft's Security Development Lifecycle team because I actually believed then that Microsoft is doing good stuff in this area and I wanted to be a part of it. For me to say that now, you might believe I'm biased, but I don't think I would have gone and taken that job if I didn't think that the work we were doing is effective. We do have numbers, but I'd prefer not to say things which you might take as a vendor pitch here in my answer, but rather say, I think we are improving. If you want to talk afterwards about how fast we should be improving versus how fast we are improving, happy to have that discussion.
Actually, I was going to ask a question about the crap.
Uh-huh. I thought that was Marcus.
I don't think it's much security problems in the software, but software that makes it hard for the users to use would lead to security issues.
Software that is hard for the user to use. It is really, really difficult to design effective tests. There's a great little workshop series called SOUP, Symposium on Usable Privacy and Security, where they are struggling in really interesting ways with how do you do an effective test of what it means for a user to sit down in a lab and resist a phishing attack. There's all sorts of complicated scientific methodological questions about, am I using my real account and treating that as I would? Am I using a fake account, in which case I don't care and I may just blow by the security stuff? So to answer your question, I think people are testing this stuff. We will learn how to do it. We are starting to learn, but it's a long, slow process. So, I was going to talk about Jon Snow and cholera. This is another great book by Stephen Johnson, and it's the story of the 1854 cholera epidemic in London. And this is really interesting to me because for a couple of reasons. One is Jon Snow actually mapped out where deaths were happening, and he did this because there were death notices in the newspaper, and he started going into these neighborhoods where people were experiencing this disease and talking to them about what they were seeing. And he did this at tremendous personal risk. Cholera was striking down healthy adults. It killed in a couple of days, and nobody knew what caused it. The leading cause was something like, the leading belief in what caused it was miasma, something like swamp gas. Snow believed it was infected water, and famously removed the handle of a pump on the Broad Street well, and the rate of infection fell a little bit faster than it was falling before. So this is interesting because there's public data, there's a willingness to go out and really dig into the data, and I think that over the last few years we've seen a very interesting source of data become available, and that's breach data out of California's 1386 and other state laws. David Mortman talked about this morning. Last week I was at a symposium at the Berkeley Center for Law and Technology on data breaches. There was some news in that on Wired and the new Assembly Bill 20. So we're really starting to see these laws become pervasive with the High-Tech Act, with laws in other countries where we are requiring notification to people that someone suffered a security breach. And the goal of these laws was to reduce the impact of ID theft and to encourage companies to spend more money on information security. And I think the real unexpected benefit that we've gotten from these laws is not, we can argue about whether or not they've reduced ID theft, but what they have done is they've given us an opportunity to study what goes wrong. And here I'd like to say thank you, ChoicePoint. Because ChoicePoint probably, after they were conned into giving over data on about 140,000 people, proceeded to do everything else wrong that they could for a couple of months and drew massive media attention to these laws. And another thing that attention did is, this is a graph of the passage of the laws. The first one was passed in September 2002. The ChoicePoint incident happened, and all of a sudden other states started passing laws because state attorneys general were saying, well, why are only California residents required to be noticed? Shouldn't people in my state have to hear about this as well? And so ChoicePoint was instrumental in bringing breach laws to most of the United States. And having watched over the last few years what these laws do, there's a whole bunch of observations we can make and hypotheses which we can test. The first key observation is that the sky doesn't fall. There are 1,500, 1,800 breaches now in the data loss DB, and in that there are 2 companies which have gone out of business. A lot of the other fears that people have not materialized. Customers don't tend to flee. The Ponemon Institute publishes numbers on this, and after most breaches, the customer churn rate is on the order of 2%. No one wants to lose 2% of your customers, but that's not what people would have predicted 5 years ago. And in fact, if you watch many security mailing lists, you will continue to see people make the assertion that if you have a breach, all of your customers will leave. I find that really astounding, given that we have a data set that people are analyzing and actually demonstrating that it doesn't happen. And without wanting to pick on anyone, I look at it as an indication of just how deep this crisis goes and just how much it has impacted our thinking, that we don't even try and study these things, that it is acceptable to go out in public and make statements like all of your customers will leave after you suffer a breach, when there is direct contradictory evidence freely available to anyone who bothers to look for it, and people like me who will jump on you and point that out. Companies going out of business, by and large, not happening. Now, if you look at the headlines today, there are a lot of reasons that companies are going out of business. Information security failures are not on the list. Massive lawsuits. There have been about 210 class action lawsuits filed as a result of these breaches. Saw a very interesting presentation on Friday by one of the lawyers who's defended about 60 of these. And most of these lawsuits are getting dismissed before the discovery phase. There is no evidence of harm in the sense that the courts require it, which is you were impacted by this, your identity was stolen, here's a direct cost. Setting up the causal linkage turns out to be incredibly difficult. And I'm just going to throw in an unjustified, untested hypothesis as someone who's looked at an awful lot of this data lately. All of your counterexamples are outliers. Feel free to prove me wrong. It's a testable hypothesis. If you have a counterexample that you'd like to bring up, I will, well, not very happily, but I will take professional responsibility and admit it when I am wrong. But really, TJX, ChoicePoint, card systems are a very few, and I apologize, I didn't update the number on this slide. It's better to talk about these problems than not. And there's this Tylenol bottle, which is sitting over on the side, because I think that the example of what happened to Tylenol in 1982 is tremendously important. 7 people died in Chicago because of product tampering with Tylenol. The Tylenol company pulled its products off the shelves. They said, we're going to figure out what happened. They've applied these tamper-resistant seals. I actually looked really hard for an old Tylenol bottle online, but the internet has a short memory and I couldn't find one. But 7 people died. They never caught the guy who did this. How many of you have taken Tylenol in the last month? How many of you remembered this? Well, you're information security geeks, what can I say? Yes?
Why should we assume that this is simply the case that we haven't reached the tipping point? So what we're seeing up now are in fact anomalies. There will be some breach that will in fact cause all of these things that happen.
As a scientist, I look at what I can see. I hypothesize about what I might see. Given the breaches of personal medical records, of Veterans Administration, I have a really hard time conceptualizing of a scenario in which all of these things would happen. And even if I can conceive of them, I'm going to assert again that that would be an outlier. That we have a normal, which is defined by a data set. Yes, there are outliers on your data set. Yes, all of these bad things might happen to you, but odds are really good that they won't.
But isn't that the black swan?
I don't believe in the black swan stuff. I believe that probability curves have long tails. I believe that, yes, things might surprise you in the future, but an awful lot of what happens in the world is predictable and analyzable. The sun might not rise tomorrow, but most of us don't spend a lot of time worrying about that. The eclipse might not pass off to the other side of the moon, but we don't spend a lot of time worrying about that. And as an engineer, I can point out that there are thousands of issues happening today which we are not addressing, and that our failure to address them Yes, if you would like to go searching for a black swan, please, be my guest. I'd like to solve the problem at the middle of the bell curve. David, then Marcus.
I would say you can argue that card systems going out of business as a result of the breach was not because of the breach notification quite easily.
Yeah, a good point, yes.
So, I mean, a good point, but just because you have a breach, you can go out of business, it's not necessarily because you told everyone you had a breach. I mean, Visa figured it out pretty quickly on their own.
Minor in on black swans, they've been being mismarketed. The whole notion of a black swan is the observation and probability distributed. The distributions have an extremely long tail, and you don't know where it is.
A fine point. There's a marketing problem, and I don't buy into the marketing. Yes, there obviously are things that are going to be off the ends of your curve that are hard to analyze until you see them. Did you have a question, Adrian?
Yeah, well, or a comment.
Please.
While I agree with an hypothesis, what I'm hearing you say sounds exactly like what I was hearing the financial modelers on Wall Street say, that, I want to solve this problem in the middle of the bell curve, and then we have something anomalous come along and the entire system falls down underneath.
Yes, it's a great comment that what I am saying sounds an awful lot what the people on Wall Street were saying. To an extent, that's true. I think my question of our keynote speaker, that we had a bad risk management model in which the banks owned all the upside and the taxpayers owned all the downside, argues that in fact everyone knew exactly what was going to happen and chose to behave with that in mind.
It's not any individual company that bears the brunt of it, it might be the system itself.
I think we are bearing the brunt of it as a system. I think our inability to act, I don't want to say I would be happy for us to have the same problem as the financial markets, but I would be happier to know that we have some models that work most of the time and to be able to estimate what the ends of the curve are and what happens in those situations than to have no models at all. And there's always a risk. There was a great article in the New York Times a month or two ago called The Problem with VAR that talked about exactly this, that we forgot that there were those ends. Yes?
I really like the idea of measurements and so on, but it just occurs to me that maybe breach laws are the wrong way.
Yeah.
Maybe what we need to just do is tell the financial industry, credit cards are going to have chip and pin.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to stop identity theft dead. Anybody who gives a loan to any other person without seeing them physically, their presence in front of them, and checking their identity, cannot collect by any method and will be sent to jail for 20 years if they so much as send a debt collection notice. And those two measures would eliminate it.
Those two measures would eliminate a fair amount of financial system fraud, but they would not eliminate, say, industrial espionage. They would not eliminate breaches of medical information, which are not remediable in the same way. So I see what you're saying, but I believe information security is broader than identity theft. So, but actually, I'd like to your original point, I think, is very important. Breach laws are an awful way to get this data. They are the worst way I can imagine to get all of this data, except they happen to be working. And given that we had tremendous resistance for all of these reasons to any disclosure of any issue, I will take what I happen to stumble across and hope to do better in the future.
Yeah, but my concern here is that the breach laws are just a way of putting off the real solution to the problem. And it's kind of like, okay, we'll fix the credit cards.
Yep.
We'll have a breach law.
I think they're a step in the right direction. And then you. No, you and then you.
Comment about the models, especially the Wall Street Journal article. People understood what the models were saying.
Mm-hmm. Yep, people understand.
The question, maybe the problem with models aren't making decisions by themselves.
So, yep, the models are not making decisions by themselves. It's a great point. Yes?
The breach notification laws may not be the solution to a lot of problems, but they certainly can help get us sufficient data to determine if the breach notification laws are helpful.
Yep. Absolutely. So I'd like to move on, and there'll be more time for questions. So what we can learn from the data, there's a lot of stuff, and I'd like to encourage all of you who have not done this to go wallow in the data for a while, to go look at what's there on Data Loss DB, to go read some of the reports that come through on sites like Pogo Was Right or Educational Security Incidents, and really understand what is out there and use it as a way to test your own beliefs. There's really no substitute for getting your hands on this stuff and saying, ooh, that surprises me. And I'm actually really excited at RSA next month. We've got an entire track on Research Revealed, where a lot of people have gone and done exactly that and learned some really interesting stuff. So if you're at RSA, I would encourage you to come check out the Research Revealed track.
Specific question about data loss.
Yes?
25 to 30% of the breaches reported do not report the number of records.
Yes.
I happen to know why that is.
25 to 35% don't report the number of records. I believe that's because it is not clearly required by all of the laws.
Okay, so how do you finesse that in your own interpretation?
How do I process the data, or what do I do about it as a problem?
Well, it's a problem of no values.
I have never done, and I have a background as an environmental scientist where I did real field observations that involve sticking my hands in swamps and things. I have never seen great data that came out of any experimental process. There's always questions about validity. So you can say, if what I'm doing is dependent on this data, then I've got to throw those observations away. If what I'm doing is not dependent on the size of the thing, then maybe I can use the data. The data will be dirty, and I am much, much happier to have dirty data than no data.
Well, I'm glad you said, I worked in medicine for a long time, and contrary to what people think, the data are very dirty in medicine.
Mm-hmm.
And as long as people understand there's probably no such thing as really clean data,
Mm-hmm.
then everybody can sort of play the same game.
Yep. So this is just a sample out of the old URL, the CSV that the data loss guys make available. You can go and download this, pop it into Excel or R or S or Mathematica or whatever you happen to like to use to do data analysis and regressions, and find out what you want to find out. It's interesting, and this is early work that I did, but one of the things that I discovered when I was griping through this data is stolen equipment accounted for about twice as many incidents as hacking. Stolen equipment was about 38%, hacking was about 22%, and then there was this accidental web category, and these all came out of local newspapers where the story was always exactly the same. It was Alice was Googling her name when she discovered an Excel spreadsheet that had her social security number in it. And I'm really curious to know how those happen. Are those instances where someone puts the spreadsheet on the web not realizing that anyone can find it, that Google will pick it up? Are they instances where it's actually password protected when they put it up and someone changes the configuration of the system? Did they drop it on a share which is being exposed to the web and they didn't realize that? I would love to know more about how those go on. And the great thing is, really simple data lets us start asking questions like this. So there's some other causes of breaches. My personal favorite is chocolate. People have done experiments where they go and offer people a bar of chocolate in exchange for what that person asserts is their password. This has all sorts of methodological difficulties, but if your information security program doesn't take into account the willingness of people to give away their passwords, why not? 45% of women in this BBC study, or excuse me, this was reported in The Guardian, were willing to give away their passwords. So breach data is a step forward, but it's not the only step that we need to take. It gives us something like random sampling, which is a huge step up from surveys. We can start to look at what problems we can apply it to. We can start to ask how we analyze the data. And we can learn that the sky hasn't fallen and that we're gaining credibility as we talk about these problems. But there's another issue that I think intersects with the unwillingness to talk about problems, and that's how we talk about them a little bit. Introductions to information security. How many people took an Intro to Information Security course in university? And if you did, you probably learned about something like operating systems. You might learn a little bit about development activity. You probably learned about Salzer and Schroeder and Bell-LaPadula and Biba integrity models, right? Some of you. You might learn a lot about RSA and AES and other forms of cryptography. These are slides that I pulled out of the top 2 things when I was looking for an introduction to network security coursework. I did a search for educational institution intro to network security, and it's all about crypto. But there's other things at work here. Computers are a product of computer security is a product of human interaction. Nobody cares at a mathematical level about phishing. It is really hard to express it effectively in mathematical terms which shed light on the issue. But there's other forms of science which are not mathematics. You can look at markets. People study markets that work and markets that don't work. There's a whole field of security economics that people are opening up. And they're looking at things like passwords. There's great stuff about compliance budgets, by which people mean the human compliance budget. How much of my day can I spend wasting time entering passwords? There's sociological issues of, if you walk down my hallway at work, you will notice that every single one of the computers has its screen locked. This is not because there's any sort of automatic screen locking in place. It's because if you don't lock your screen, it's perfectly legitimate to sit down and do whatever you want to that person's computer. And you can't complain when it's done to you. Usually this takes the form of sending email, declaring your love for someone. It's also taken the form of replacing screen backgrounds, rootkitting each other's machines. Hey, I work in security. You're expected to know how to remove this stuff. So we can study the economics of this. We can look at things like Nash equilibria as a window, and I'm running a little short on time here, so I'm going to go a little quickly. But Nash equilibria, if you've seen the film A Beautiful Mind, it's about why it's hard to break out of certain types of technology situations or market situations. We can look at things like chasm crossing, which comes out of a guy named Jeff Moore who studied how markets work. Most security startups that I talked to 5 years ago had never heard of that book. If you're trying to build a startup and you haven't read Jeff Moore's book, you're doing several things wrong. Number one, you haven't read his book. Number two, you have the wrong set of advisors. And I'm very confident in those statements, but I can't prove them, so what the heck. We can also look at insecure software as, why do people buy crap, going back to David's question. Part of the answer may relate to the transaction costs of evaluation, right? How much does it cost to evaluate a piece of software against some set of criteria? I actually know the answer in relation to my employer software. We spend a lot of money evaluating it. We would love to spend that money in other ways. Psychological issues are also really important. There's an area of psychological study called risk compensation or risk homeostasis. You've heard about this if you understand why anti-lock brakes actually increase accident rates. You put anti-lock brakes into a car, people believe they can stop faster, they drive more aggressively, and they drive so much more aggressively with anti-lock brakes that they actually cause more accidents. This is based on a study in Austria where they did this to half of all the taxi cabs in the city. So they had a homogeneous population of drivers in a single place. We can actually study issues like what causes car accidents because we report on the data. We can apply scientific methods and we can learn things. Oh, anti-lock brakes aren't as good an idea as I might have thought. We can look at spending as well. Spending is really interesting. Where do people put their scarce resources? That tells you what they actually care about. There was this thing going around a few years ago that businesses spend more information on coffee than information security, and how awful that was, right? Businesses obviously care more about coffee than information security. Well, is it a bad thing? Are businesses going out of business because they're not spending on information security? Would businesses get a substantial productivity hit if they didn't fill their employees with coffee all day? Maybe it's not such a bad thing. Maybe business allocation of resources is, if not what we would like, understandable, justifiable. And if we would like to change it, we are going to have to work to speak a language which the people who can change it will understand. Definitely don't have time to go into Gordon and Loeb's 37% number. Gordon and Loeb are professors at the University of Maryland Business School, and they did some very interesting work which shows with good mathematical bases that you should not spend more than 37% of the value of an asset to protect it. That surprises a lot of people who figure you can probably spend 75, 80, 90% and still be efficient. This is a justified number. This isn't something they pulled out of thin air, and I would urge you to take a look at the paper. So the road to utopia, it's long. It's a little hard to see what's off in the distance. People are people. Economic issues like externalities are not just going to go away. Human-computer interface issues are really hard. We are going to continue arguing about the meaning of threat and vulnerability for a while. But I believe that we can do better. I believe that there is a clear path that we can go down that will help us do better, that when we have applied these techniques in other areas of life, we talk about them because they work. And so, as I said, this came out of work that Andrew Stewart and I did in the New School of Information Security. And so I'd like to encourage all of you to join us. It's not something we created, it's something we tried to put a little bit of a label on. And I'd like to encourage you to join the New School by gathering good data, by sharing it, by analyzing it. I'd like to encourage those of you who are in academia or in industry to change how you teach things, change what you are talking about as you are talking about security, and change the questions that you are asking. You know, my slightly snarky question this morning, or comment about bankers understanding risk, comes because I now spend most of my time reading economics and sociology rather than reading information security, because the things I learned from those other disciplines I bring back and I get to sound like I'm smart or something. And then make money from this stuff. People like Verizon Business, who are releasing their data breach report, people like the Ponemon Institute, who are doing analysis of what happens to companies. You can make money gathering and analyzing data, and you can build credibility for yourself by giving most of it away. So I believe that there is a tremendous and exciting future, and I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
So one of the, there was a lot of mention about the data loss DB being probably one of the best sources of data that we have, but not, certainly not the most, certainly not comprehensive. What other sources of breach data or data loss data would you point people to?
So there's the data loss DB, there's the Verizon business report, there's the Ponemon Institute. Excuse me? Privacyrights.org. There's a couple of things which are coming out in the next month or so.
Does the Privacy Rights Clearinghouse actually do their own data anymore, or do they still pull from data loss?
I believe they are collaborating between privacy rights and data loss, so the data is getting more and more similar.
We have a data loss guy here. If he isn't feeling too shy, he can speak up and you can talk to him directly.
Is he in the room?
He is in the room.
I have these bright, sorry. I have these bright lights in my eyes, so it's sort of hard to see if I'm looking that way. Other questions? Yes?
How do you feel about the main breach report?
How do I feel about the main breach report? I thought it was really interesting. What the main breach report is, the Maine Department of Financial Services got a set of data from various banks and decided to publish their analysis of it. They said, this is how much it cost for Hannaford. This is how much TJX cost. And I somewhat famously misspoke because one of the interesting things out of that report was that per abused account, not per account, but per abused account, the criminals were taking about $450 per card they had stolen. I thought that was a really interesting number. I spoke a little sloppily, but little bits of new data give us new information which we can use, which we can say, okay, if these people are taking $500 per card, maybe dropping my credit limit from $10,000 to $2,000 isn't going to be impactful. So why is my bank doing this and saying it's a result of these breaches? So I am happy to look at new pieces of data wherever they come from. Other questions? No? All right. Well, thank you very much for your time. Okay.